Well, of course, over the course of this election, we've heard a lot of talk around issues like vaccines, housing, and jobs. But one issue we've not heard a lot about has been Islamophobia.
We are all diminished when any one of us is targeted.
This is Canada. This is a part of the country we live in. We've got to deal with it. We can't deny it. We can't ignore it. We have to confront it.
Our first duty as political leaders is to ensure the security of our citizens and to ensure that Canadians can be free to live, work, and pray as they wish.
Now, those are just some of the statements we heard in June after a Muslim family in London, Ontario, was killed in an alleged targeted attack. Now, at the time, there was a major outpouring of grief. And since then, the major party leaders have repeatedly made statements condemning hate and attacks against Muslims. But actually tackling the problem, well, that is another matter altogether. So the National Council of Canadian Muslims, they've been looking at the federal party platforms and assessing the priorities on the topic. And to talk about this, we're now reaching out to the Executive Director of the Council, Mustafa Farooq, who's in Ottawa. Mustafa, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before we talk about the platforms themselves, I do want to ask you, have the parties, have the leaders, have they done enough to talk about Islamophobia during the course of this campaign?
Well, I think, first of all, it's worth noting that all three of the major party leaders, Erin O'Toole, the Prime Minister, Jagmeet Singh, have all talked about Islamophobia at some point during this campaign. But I think that the bigger problem, and I think for Canadians who are watching and listening and thinking about Election Day, the bigger problem is that all three of the leaders have not done nearly enough to address the challenge of systemic racism and Islamophobia. And this is not some sort of like woke, call to action. This is about looking at some very serious realities. 3 months ago, we had somebody in a car run down a family, and there have been many violent attacks that have taken place since, targeting members of the Canadian Muslim community. And if you're curious about that, I just invite you to just type it in and look for yourself. The reality is that we don't just need to hear our politicians talking about systemic racism and Islamophobia. We need to see them making this a serious issue, and in whoever forms government on Monday or thereafter. I'm hoping to see that all of them commit to positive policy change.
Okay, listen, we'll get into specifics in a moment here, but let's begin with what you've seen of the platforms. Again, your organization has examined it very closely. So of what has been stated here by the major parties, what has stood out? What do you like so far?
Well, I think there's a number of positive things in a number of party platforms. So, for example, we were pleased to see in the Liberal Party platform a commitment around a national plan around hate. We were very pleased to see a commitment that recommendations from the Islamophobia Summit will be implemented. We were pleased to see a focus on dealing with the way that hate crimes are dealt with in this country. The reality is that hate crimes don't just target members of the Muslim community. They target members of many communities, including Asian Canadians, Jewish Canadians, Black Canadians. So we were pleased to see that commitment. And we were also pleased to see a commitment for something that NCCM put forward for a national victim support fund of hate. In other party platforms, in the NDP platform, we were very pleased to see a commitment for a special envoy on Islamophobia. The reality is that many of these leaders have talked about the need to confront Islamophobia, but we haven't seen specific funding allocations that are specifically directed towards building an office to challenge Islamophobia at the federal level. And so we were very pleased to see that commitment. And on the Conservative side, we were very pleased to see a commitment around changing the way the security infrastructure program works, and also committing to a approach to regulate social media companies in a way that was balanced and constitutionally sound. Those are sort of the big good parts. But I think what sort of for Canadians to keep in mind is that these are unfortunately somewhat of a drop in the bucket scenario in terms of actually solving the problem.
Well, let's pick up there, because that's not the first time you're saying this. So specifically, what would you like to have seen? What do you hope comes about whatever party forms the next government?
Sure. So I think, first of all, one of the major gaps that I think we've seen very clearly has been a refusal by all three parties to confront systemic discrimination on the books in Bill 21 in Quebec. Bill 21 in Quebec legislates a different set of circumstances for Quebec Muslims, Quebec Jews, Quebec Sikhs. So if you wear a turban, if you wear a hijab, if you wear a kippah, you're not allowed to become a prosecutor. You're not allowed to become a police officer. The fact that all of our, major political party leaders have decided to stand on the altar of political expediency rather than on the altar of principle, of doing the right thing, is something that should concern all Canadians, especially considering the fact that Bill 21 is essentially backed by a quasi-emergency power in the notwithstanding clause. This is not sort of a Quebec issue versus an Anglo issue. This is a human rights issue. And it's disappointing to see our politicians not stand up for basic human rights.
What do you make to the argument then?
Muslims.
What do you make of the argument then? Because Sachi Curl, who moderated the English language debate, of course, has gotten a lot of heat in Quebec for asking the question that she did in that debate. And to hear it from Quebecers, they don't see it as a racist law. They see it as taking a stand for the preservation of the French language and culture in Quebec.
So first of all, I've never met a racist who, and I've met many, unfortunately, I've never met a racist who self-proclaimed to be a racist. Most of us don't self-proclaim or admit easily to the fact that something that we're doing is problematic or wrong. What I will say is what has sort of been affirmed in Quebec courts in our lawsuit challenging Bill 21. The decision of the judge coming out of the Superior Court was quite clear that Bill 21 did circumscribe a different set of realities for Quebec Muslims and Quebec Jews and Quebec Sikhs than others. And there's just no doubt about that. That's exactly why the notwithstanding clause, a quasi-emergency power, was used to shelter this bill, because everyone knew that this would violate key fundamental freedoms of religious freedom. There's simply no sort of getting around that. Now, that doesn't mean that criticisms of, that all Quebecers are racist or all Quebecers are inherently Islamophobic. Not at all. And that's why we've seen a huge outpouring of Quebecers standing up, including in the courts with us, to say enough is enough. We need to stop this piece of legislation.
Okay, I've got 30 seconds left. What should Canadians then be keeping in mind as they head to the polls tomorrow from your vantage point?
I think what Canadians need to keep in mind is the future. What kind of future do we want to see? Both, after this election, are we going to keep our politicians to account for the promises they've made, for the promises for a safer Canada for everyone? That is the question that we need to answer.
Mustafa Farooq, thank you. I appreciate the time today.
Thank you.
And that's the Executive Director of the National Council of Canadian Muslims.